Welcome, everyone. My name is Stacey Blakely. I am the Executive Director of the Policy Circle, and I thank you for joining us today. This is a unique opportunity for friends, supporters, donors, and partners of the Policy Circle to gather together to have a conversation on what we think is a critical topic. As all of you on this call know, the Policy Circle's mission is to inform and equip women to become more effective and impactful civic leaders. A big piece of this is information. We obviously do this through our briefs and our programming, but we often have a conversation about disinformation. How do we isolate and find reliable sources of information? And how does disinformation shape the way that we think about public policy, foreign policy? So today, our goal is to shed some light on the power of words, especially as it relates to the war in Ukraine. And so I'm joined today by three incredible women who you're going to have an opportunity to interact with directly. So throughout our call, please pop your questions in the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from, and let's make sure that we utilize this time to engage and ask questions. So on the call today, we have Heather Nauert. She's the former Department of State spokesperson, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, and has spent decades on major media network, really understanding these issues that we're talking about today from two unique perspectives. We also have Dr. Kimberly Kagan. She's the president and founder of the Institute for the Study of War. We're delighted to have you here, Dr. Kagan. And one of Dr. Kagan's colleagues is Kateryna Stepanenko. She is a Russia researcher for the Institute for the Study of War. She is also from Ukraine, where most of her family still resides. So again, she's providing several unique perspectives for us today. But welcome, ladies. I'm so glad you joined us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, okay, we're all unmuted. We're all on camera together. So let's just jump right in. And, I've had the opportunity to discuss this with you guys individually. So now let's talk about it together. The power of words. No one can discount how incredibly important it is in terms of word choice when you start describing a conflict, when you start characterizing a leader. And we have seen this throughout this conflict. So Heather, I'm going to start with you because early on it was an incursion. It was a minor incursion. There was big blowback right from that. And then we went into different sort of ways that this was being described by the US government and different parts of the administration. Can you give us a little insight, having been on the front lines in the State Department? How do they decide, right? How does an administration decide how to characterize and then to have consistent messaging? I think that's going to be an important place to start.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Determining what messaging any person in the US government uses, any words that they use, is something that's just not willy-nilly. It is thoroughly vetted. There's an extreme process that the government goes through in order to determine what to characterize something, whether it's an incursion, whether it's a hot war, whether it's a cold war, whether the State Department is concerned or gravely concerned about the situation. All of that is extremely vetted. It usually starts with the National Security Council and then an interagency process. And that means that the Department of Defense, the Department of State, Department of Treasury, all the experts on any given topic have the opportunity to weigh in on how we're going to characterize something. And then it goes through this process where even cabinet secretaries and others will weigh in, and then that becomes US policy. It tends to not change a lot from administration to administration. However, every administration will have its own tone, its own flavor for doing things. One recent example is President Joe Biden came out last week and referred to Putin as a war criminal. Now, that's something that wasn't agreed to by the interagency, but that's something that the president said. So once the president does say something like that, then it becomes policy. So everyone has to adjust a little bit when the president gets a little out there and says something, even if it may or may not be true. Dr. Kagan, I'd welcome your thoughts on that. Hopefully I characterized that okay.
Oh my goodness, of course you characterized it brilliantly. I can. What I can add is a little bit of perspective from the Department of Defense, and in particular from our uniformed military, since I've had the privilege to work with our uniformed military in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the most challenging things about being the uniformed military is that words have definitions, and it's really important that they do. Defeat has a definition, that it has a military definition. It means that the enemy loses either the will or the capability to fight. And so one of the differences that we see, or one of the struggles that we see in the formulation of this interagency discussion on what's happening in a war, is that the military actually needs to use words with very specific meanings in order to give the entire large military organization unity of definition and purpose so that they can pursue their mission. Therefore, when we think about some of the controversies back in the Obama administration about whether the United States was going to defeat ISIS or whether it was going to destroy ISIS, those two words have very different meanings for the military. And it means that the behaviors and the options that the military can pursue are different by definition. And so that makes it really an interesting problem for senior policymakers, and a very passionate problem for those who wear a uniform.
So just to add on to that, Stacey, and this is a great example, if the military was referring to something as a defeat from the State Department and a State Department briefing, I would have to use that same terminology. That's why oftentimes from the government, you end up with this kind of mealy-mouthed language that to the average American, it's like, why are you saying things that sound so wimpy? Well, it's because these words have a very specific meaning. And I have to tell you that we don't appreciate this as Americans. But if you are in another government, if you are somewhere around the world, you are listening so closely, so carefully to everything that comes out of the White House, the Department of Defense, and the State Department. And countries can literally go to war over differences or perceived differences in what the US government might say or how we might characterize a situation. So the words chosen are very, very important, and they're all purposeful.
Well, and I think you bring up a really interesting point here, because if you look at the words that the US chooses to use, right, and how we choose to respond specifically in the Ukraine, and how does that empower Russia, or does it discourage? I mean, there's been some comments that because the US came out, I think early on in the conflict, and maybe was not using perhaps such strong language, that there was sort of an emboldening of Putin early on based on sort of the message that the US was sending out, that we were reluctant to get involved. Dr. Kagan, any thoughts on sort of the messaging that was early in this conflict and how that could have played out, with Putin?
Well, certainly. I think it's important that we as Americans and our policymakers actually call things what they are. This is a war of aggression by the Russians against Ukraine. This is not a conflict. I mean, I suppose it is too, but it is a war. And it is really important to call it what it is. It's also a war that has been going on since 2014, when in fact, Putin actually invaded the territory of Ukraine, occupied parts of it, and then claimed parts of it as his own and others as occupied segments. That doesn't mean that we, the United States, have been talking about it incorrectly, but it's actually really an important component of why the Ukrainians themselves are so prepared for what Putin has done in his war of aggression. They have been learning from their military experience and their government experience since 2014 and preparing for contingencies of Putin's use of armed force. So I think it's really also incredibly important to recognize what Putin is doing, what his aims are. And to recognize that we're in a war, and frankly, it's going to be a long war.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it's so simply stated, but we can't overstate it enough. Calling things what they are, using the appropriate language has consequences, not just in the United States, right, but across the world. And where we've seen an incredible example of that is in Zelenskys leadership. And really, honestly, let's be honest, more important than his leadership, his communication skill, right? And so I'd really love to start with Kateryna, if you don't mind, sharing with us. Obviously, we've seen the impact that Zelensky has had in unifying the West, in spurring action that I think many thought was impossible in terms of a unified response. Can you share with us a little bit from the Ukrainian perspective, how important his communication skills have been to his people?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much for hosting me today. Zelensky has been, what is important to note about Zelensky is that he has been a prominent figure of Ukrainian TV shows and just a celebrity of sense, an important influential figure for many years, since I believe 1999. And so his presence already has that charisma that a lot of Ukrainian politicians do not have in the past. It's important to note that Zelensky has pivoted since the beginning of his presidency to using social media, and that has gained him a lot of popularity both during his presidential campaigns and during this war right now, where he's able to effectively use platforms such as Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, in order to convey in both Ukrainian and English the situation that is going on in Ukraine, as well as offer an emotional plea to Western communities about what is going on in Ukraine, and in a sense, even offer some kind of a shame to policymakers worldwide. And I've been observing this for a while now, and Zelensky's team is very effectively using social media algorithms, something that Russia is not necessarily good at yet. And a prime example of that is at the beginning, the first week of war, Ukrainian government set up for every single regional administration and every single mayor a Telegram channel where Ukrainians can interact with the local government and understand what is going on the ground. And that communication, in my opinion, is probably the strongest point of Zelensky's appeal to Ukrainian people, in the sense that they're not getting their information from somewhere, quoted from a particular source, but hands-on from his government. And I think that is where Ukrainians are winning the information war, and that's gaining him a lot of support. Of course, his videos walking around war-torn Kiev, images of him in hospitals, that helps a lot in the war messaging, in the sense that it shows that he's still present on the ground, and it disrupts all of the Russian attempts to constantly claim that he has fled the country, or the United States has created some kind of a background for him. All of these outlandish claims that otherwise would have stuck, but is not necessarily possible now because of the outslew of communication grounds that Ukraine has created. Well,
and that authenticity, obviously, right, that plays a big role in this. And Heather, I'm wondering if you could just shed some light, if you think about how effective Zelensky is on the international stage and what impact that's had on the, again, sort of a unified response that many people thought wasn't possible. Can you kind of, I don't want you to grade him, obviously, but share with us what you think, the impact has been.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. He has succeeded at rallying the entire free world behind him, really. And it takes a lot to get Americans sort of off their tails and paying attention to a foreign situation. And everywhere I drive, I'll drive through a little suburban community and I see Ukrainian flags up. So he's really rallied the support, not just of America, but of Europeans as well. And he's done that by beating the Russians at the messaging game. Now, Russia used to be quite good at this. They're very good at propaganda. It's ridiculous propaganda, but nevertheless, they've always been good at it. But Zelensky has beaten it at them. And I think part of it is through authenticity. He knows how to message from his media background and experience. You see him out in the field, meeting with soldiers, meeting with them in a hospital. He's not clean shaven. He's not wearing a tie. He's wearing a t-shirt. And it shows that he's a man in the thick of things. The other day I noticed he held up his cell phone and he played for television cameras a recording of an explosion and air sirens. And he said, this is what we hear every day. And that's just one minor thing, but it really evokes such an image and such a response on the part of Westerners. He's just handled it very beautifully. He's really done a spectacular job.
Well, and Dr. Kagan, let's shift a little bit here, because we're talking about Zelensky as an individual, you know, a skilled communicator. He's obviously surrounded himself by people who really have understood how to engage social media. And now we look at the Russian propaganda machine. And historically, you know, Russia's definitely had their successes when it comes to sowing disinformation around elections, and really, you know, they've been involved in so many disinformation campaigns. But for this particular conflict, it's not been as effective, I think, as most of us had expected. Can you kind of break down for us maybe the failures of the Russian propaganda? And then I want to shift after that and talk about where it's been successful with his own people. So can you give us a rundown on what's going on there with Russia?
Absolutely. First, Putin has previously excelled at conducting disinformation campaigns, misinformation campaigns, or even controlling and shaping the information narrative, not necessarily through falsehood, but through distortions of truth or repetitions of memes. And one of the things that Putin set out to do before the conflict, the war actually began, is he set out to paint the Ukrainians as aggressors and to create false flag attacks, which means to create the impression that the Ukrainians had taken an aggressive action when in fact Russian intelligence had done so. He had worked very hard to try to ensnare Ukrainian politicians in a variety of acts of aggression, all of which were fabricated. He failed. One of the reasons he failed is that the United States government actually took on every single one of these messages and refuted it, brought to light the falsifications that he was trying to perpetuate, and did so not only with other governments, but also with our news media. And the result is that Putin did not actually get the pretext for invasion that he had sought for 6 months, but rather had to declare an open act of aggression against Ukraine. I think this has been incredibly important to the ability of Zelensky and others to rally the world's support around Ukraine, because there is no pretext. This is a war of aggression. Now, since the beginning of the war, Putin has changed his behavior a little bit in the information space, because he's lost the edge that had really been with him until the beginning of the war. A few things have happened. First and foremost, US and international media platforms have taken the microphone away. We no longer find on YouTube, for example, Russian state TV and things that were there before. That's really important. And it means that Putin can't communicate as effectively with the wider world as he had prior to the beginning of the conflict. Secondly, the conflict is not going well for Putin. Putin clearly set out objectives that he thought would lead to the surrender of Ukraine in just a couple of days. The war is going terribly for the Russian military. And the truth is not viable. And that means he has had to have a falsified propaganda campaign toward his people, which I think Katya can talk more about. The last thing that I think is really important is to know, though, that Putin is trying to regain the information space and regain the narrative. And so it's very important to pay attention to the means that the Kremlin uses. When you hear someone saying that the Ukrainian government or Ukrainians are Nazis, that's a Kremlin line. I certainly would never want to repeat as truth anything that the Kremlin has said, but it's really important to know what they're saying, because they are trying to discredit the Ukrainian government, and they're trying to make the world doubt Ukraine in order to cease providing the help that Ukraine needs actually to sustain this fight.
Yeah,
Stacey,
go ahead, Heather.
if I can add something, Dr. Kagan, you'll appreciate this, but when I was at the State Department, I would sit in on meetings with the foreign minister of Russia, and there would be 5 Americans on one side of the table and 5 or 6 Russians on the other side of the table, usually led by their foreign minister Lavrov. And we would sit in these meetings and we'd have conversations about closing their consulates in the United States, because the United States said, you have spies there, and they're not really diplomats, they're spies. And so we would have these conversations with them, and I would watch as the Russians would literally lie again. And they're so good at it, and they can say it with a straight face. But we as Americans, and in particular those in the government who are working in the space at the time, know it is not true. Our European friends and allies also know that what the Russian government states is not true. So you have many countries, those NATO members, coming together knowing not to believe this Russian disinformation. Even our American-based reporters who cover foreign affairs know that Russia lies. It's just part of their MO. We've seen it time and time again. Some of our listeners today may remember there was a poisoning of and a death of a former Russian spy in England. His name was Skripal. And it was both this former spy and his daughter who were killed. They died. And Russia claimed that others were responsible for their death. They had used a poison called Novichok. It was the use of a poison that has not been used on European soil since World War II. So this was super significant. And Russia claimed that Britain was responsible. They said, Brexit is going so badly, therefore the UK is responsible. Then another story that they had was, oh, well, the West is actually responsible for this because they wanted to disrupt our elections. And so as watchers of all this, we're just like scratching our heads saying, really, Russia? This is another lie. So the West was wise to this for many, many years, as were our NATO partners and the news media who covers foreign affairs. So I think that's why Putin's misinformation and disinformation has not succeeded by and large.
But here's the challenge, and what I find so perplexing is in Russia, you still have a huge, I think, portion of that population. Kateryna, you can speak to this. They believe what comes out of the Kremlin, and you look at the rally, you look at the talking points that are being pushed out. And, you know, I've read stories where family members live in the Ukraine and they're trying to explain to their Russian family members what's happening. They don't believe them. So while we see it as like, these are outlandish claims, how can anybody believe this? Can you give us some insight, though, of how he's winning the propaganda war with his own people, or is he?
It's actually been very interesting to observe the situation on Russian domestic media. So to give you a brief observation of what it looks like, most TV reporting right now is showing select clips of the war. A lot of times they emphasize interviewing civilians in Donbass, for example, where they claim, you know, genocide is still ongoing. We did see an increase in the genocide claims that expanded from December, when we first saw it mentioned by Putin, until to exponential levels where now we see it every day. It's a portrayal of an immediate threat, but it's also really important to say that Russian domestic programming is now heavily emphasizing that Russian military campaign is extremely successful, and it has an immediate need for it, because Ukraine and NATO are threatening Russian culture Russian history and Russian language, as well as livelihoods of all ethnic Russians, which includes, obviously, in their opinion, Ukrainian lands. So what we're seeing is it's challenging because Russians, especially younger Russians, they've had access to the internet for 8 years of this war conflict, where now Russia is shifting this narrative that you need to promote self-censorship. We're not seeing a lot of reports of protests. We're seeing a lot of news publications closing down, independent news publications closing down. So that sends a messaging to people, as it did in the Soviet Union, that they need to watch out for what they're saying, otherwise they're going to be next. And then the other thing is there is a separation. The Russian programming currently is kind of pointing this thing where it's only certain military men that are involved in this war. It's not everyone, it's not everyone's sons. And the other messaging that we're seeing on social media from moms and all of the family relatives saying that, it's not necessarily us, it's our government. So there's nothing we can do about it. So I feel like there is some sort of awareness, especially with the rally and how terribly it was staged. For everyone listening in, there was a rally a couple of days ago where a lot of people, government workers, were brought in to listen to Putin and promptly left after 30 minutes, some reports allege, promptly left because it was massively organized. This shows us that there is some sort of awareness within Russians. I'm sure they are aware. There's probably a sense of pride among Russians that helps to ignite that sense of maybe Ukrainians do deserve it after all. But there's also fear. I feel like there's a sense of fear of both the Kremlin as well as a minor fear of this could be worse. This could expand into Russia. Maybe their allegations could be correct. We do not know. This is not in our power. So that's a brief overview.
That's really
for domestic
assessment of that. And I think I'm seeing a lot of questions start to pop up. So I do want to transition to those. But one kind of piece of this that I think is interesting as we talk about sort of the Kremlin talking points and our ability to decipher what's true and not true. I have found it somewhat baffling. And Heather, you and I have discussed this about certain media figures who appear to be using some of those talking points in news coverage and on social media. Some surprising takes, if you will.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little insight on that? Because I found it a little perplexing.
Yeah. First, if I could hit on something that Katya said, and I want to add on to that, because remember, Russia's an authoritarian government, an authoritarian regime. People who criticize the government can be imprisoned. They may disappear. They may never be seen from again. Some of them may even be killed. Some of his toughest critics have been poisoned, have died, or have been, as we've just seen with Navalny, a major political competitor, was just sentenced to a longer prison term than expected. So I think there's a lot of fear among regular Russians, knowing that if they criticize the government in a very public way, that the same thing could happen to them. To your question here about American conservative commentators and some politicians, even on Capitol Hill, Republicans, who are spewing these pro-Russian lines. One example is, this is Ukraine's fault because they wanted to join NATO. Well, frankly, Ukraine is not only a democratic country, it's a country that has every right to fear Russia, as they have been invaded in the past. There has been, as Dr. Kagan talked about, a hot war that has been going on for years in an area called Donbass. Most Americans never would have heard of it, but that has been going on for quite some time. So we've all really been aware of that. And for American commentators to say that it's Ukraine's fault is complete baloney. So I asked myself, why are these people who would be seemingly intelligent be spewing such ridiculous stuff? I chalk it up to this. They want to be provocative. They want to get more followers on Twitter. They want America to disengage from international engagements and look at taking care of America first. Now, part of that, I understand. I understand the desire to just want to look at things in our own country. But as we have all seen, if the United States doesn't remain engaged internationally, really bad things happen, like a 9/11, for example. So it pays to remain engaged internationally. I think these people are saying these ridiculous things. We have members of Congress and others on television because they want to get more Twitter followers, because they want to get more people hiring them to give speeches. There's this celebrity sort of a desire that they have, and they get more attention that way. I think they know what they're saying is completely disingenuous and baloney, but they're doing it only for attention.
Well, and then they get picked up and put on state-run media in Russia. That's just really not a good look. So I mean, and a challenge there. Okay, so one thing I want to put out there, and Maddie, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I would love for people to use the feature at the bottom of their screen to raise their hand, because then I think I get to call on actual people, because we've got questions in the chat, but I would love it if anybody wants to raise their hand. And then Maddie, you can help me figure out how the heck we call on people, because it'd be great to bring some people onto the screen with us. Is that possible?
Yes. Sorry, I'm coming in as kind of voiceover here, but yes. So just raise. I think, Stacey, if you want to answer some questions that we've got.
Okay.
And then people, I will let you know when people raise their hand, you'll see it under attendees, but we'd love for people to, get a chance to speak with all of our panelists here. So yeah.
All right. I'm going to go with Julie Geyer's question here. She's like, if chemical bionuclear is used any place in the Ukraine, ooh, this is a big question, y'all. Dr. Kagan, you get ready for this. If chemical bionuclear is used anywhere in the Ukraine, do you think the NATO will be forced to enter the war?
I think it is possible that Putin will use chemical, biological, or radiological agents in Ukraine, that he would consider using a tactical nuclear weapon. These are threats that he is hinting at in his information campaigns, but also acting on. I am not really familiar with many armies who shoot at nuclear power plants and do so in order to achieve peaceful effects. So, we should be prepared. The United States and NATO should be prepared for a chemical, a biological, or a radiological attack. Does that mean that NATO must come in the war? No. But I think that there are some really important principles at stake. If the United States and its NATO allies, if the free world does not actually stand up against the use of nuclear, biological, chemical, or radiological weapons, ignoring them means normalizing them. Yeah. And we have, to our shame, really ignored the use of chemical weapons inside of Syria and the targeting of populations with those chemical weapons. If chemical weapons or biological weapons, radiological weapons are used on the continent of Europe and the United States and NATO decide not to act, or simply to act outraged but not take action, then I think we set a very dangerous principle, and authoritarian regimes around the world will learn that they have impunity or think that they have impunity.
Heather?
Stacey, if I could add on to that, there's actually a precedent for this, and Dr. Kagan just hit on it, and that is Syria. What many folks may not know is that Russia was heavily engaged in the conflict in Syria. Many of us will remember when American forces went in and worked alongside the Kurds to defeat ISIS, and we were successful in doing so. Russia likes to get involved in really murky, ugly situations and make it worse for a whole lot of reasons. But Russia was using chemical weapons on hospitals, maternity wards, schools, killing innocent women and children. We saw video across the news. It was just horrific. What happened as a result? Well, there was a joint strike between the US, the British, and the French. We did that. So we took some action that way against the Syrian regime and their partners, the Russians, in this. And then it went to the United Nations, and they issued some resolutions. It's basically where the United Nations says, oh, Russia, you're bad, you were involved in this. And nothing else happens as a result. So Vladimir Putin, looking at that situation, saw that the world did not act, other than, some strikes, some limited strikes, and then UN resolutions. We didn't do anything as a world to condemn, to seriously condemn and fight back against chemical weapons use of civilians, women and children. And so they may be calculating now, they didn't do anything then, why would they do anything today?
Well, and one of the things I think that and Kateryna, you might have brought this up to me, but when we talk about sort of the biological weapons, that's where you see, Russia will accuse others of doing things that it either plans on doing or is already doing. And so you've seen that narrative has been picked up. Is the US do we have bio labs in the Ukraine, right? I'm sure people that are listening have heard this filter through on social media. It's been some talking points on, various news sort of punditry, but what are you seeing as you monitor that disinformation that maybe really is a signal that he's saying other people are doing something that he plans on doing? Have you seen specific instances of that?
So the narrative actually came up at the beginning of COVID-19 from what I could assess, that they kind of tested and run with it for a little bit to see how well it would go. I actually have seen traces of that on Ukrainian television a couple of years ago of the chemical biolabs sponsored by Department of Defense. We've seen the progression of this narrative going from being mentioned once in November or December by Russian defense minister to taking a toll where now there's several investigative committees in Russia going on about, the falsely accused Ukrainian premise for an attack on Donbass with chemical weapons. And so much so that a lot of State Duma officials are coming out and saying that Ukraine was planning an immediate attack on Donbass, and only the Russian military operation prevented it. It's interesting. It could be used for both false flag attack as well as to continue that justification of why they're dragging on the war for a little longer and why their military operation of 15 days did not essentially come to life. It is alarming to see that this also spreads to other non-Western media spheres. We're seeing reports from Indian outlets claiming the same thing, that NATO and the US are planning a bio attack, which is a different point in itself, that it might seem that Russia has lost the propaganda, essentially, war on the Western front. However, they're intensifying their resources right now to target all of the remaining countries that are still maintaining economic ties with them. And this is one of the narratives that they could be using as well in order to blame Ukraine and the US for a potential biochemical radiological attack.
That's a great point. Dr. Kagan, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that this is false. The United States is not developing bioweapons inside of Ukraine. In fact, the United States has worked since 1991 to really diminish the stockpiles and the effects of the Soviet biological, chemical and radiological stores that really were throughout the Soviet Union. And so this is something, again, to go to Heather's point, that the Russians should know is untrue because they are the ones who were responsible for creating those labs in the first place. But they take advantage of the fact that there is time and distance between the truth and now to try to confuse us. And we must not be confused. We must not fall for it. We're too smart for that.
Yeah, and just to put a finer point on that, the United States does not have chemical or biological weapons programs in Ukraine, period, end of story.
So when we find a point like that, right, it needs to be dispelled, it needs to go away. What do you think in terms of the average American, right? Let's kind of think about anybody that's out there. There is a distrust of mainstream media. I mean, I'm going to tell you what's interesting is I've seen on social media amongst some people that I really respect, saying, oh, look, they fed us a narrative on COVID. Now they're feeding us a narrative on the Ukraine because there's distrust, right? And in certain factions of the US, I'm not going to say that's broad, but the survey results are pretty dismal when it looks at the American people's trust of mainstream media. So as average Americans, how can we discern reliable sources of information, and how can we be more judicious about what we share? And I know, Dr. Kagan, if you want to jump in on that first, and then just kind of give some folks that are listening some thoughts on that.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity, because we at the Institute for the Study of War are working very hard to put out every day an update on what is transpiring on the ground in Ukraine, complete with a map. And you can find these products on our Twitter handle at the Study of War, and on our website, understandingwar.org. And look, the reason I'm telling you this is not only because I want to plug my own site and the great work that Katya is doing, but also because it's very hard to follow a war. And I give our professional journalists a lot of credit for trying to cover the war in Ukraine in a fairly balanced and accurate way, and in a sustained way. Does that mean that they're perfect? No. Does that mean that they are doing fairly well? Yes. But here's why it's hard to talk about an ongoing war in Ukraine. And so I just want to lay out some things that make it really, really hard. First of all, US government officials, as Heather described, cannot respond necessarily on the same day to events that transpire and things that they see. They have to go through a process. And so when our Department of Defense or our government officials are speaking, they're very often telling or relaying facts about what's happening on the ground, but time delayed, 2 or 3 days late. And so their stories are behind the news, and they're not always clear that they are talking about something that happened a little while ago. And that creates a sense of confusion for us. As readers of news and listening to our government, but it should not create a sense of distrust. It means that we have to think carefully and put things on a timeline and really understand what is transpiring. A second phenomenon that is making it very, I think, challenging to understand what's happening in the war is that we're all used to following insurgencies like the ones in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Syria. And the last time most of us actually followed what was happening in a conventional war was, well, I'll date myself, was the Gulf War in 1991. Yeah. And so one of the things that we're doing is watching journalists try to describe what's happening on the basis of explosions here or explosions there, rather than narrating and exploring the creation of the front lines of conventional forces that the Russians are bringing to bear and that the Ukrainians are bringing to bear against them. It's possible to understand what's happening. It's just hard. So let's give our media credit for trying to explain something that's very complicated. And let's understand the reasons why our government is going to trail what's happening and not decide that they are not trustworthy, but have sympathy that it's actually hard to relay what's going on in a complex situation.
Yeah, Stacey, can I add on to that? Because I worked in news and then I worked on the other side when I was working for the State Department and managed communicating with a large group of US and also international reporters. To Dr. Kagan's point, there is a gap between an incident happening and when the US government can comment on it. And during that gap, that's when people will rush in to try to fill the gap. And sometimes it's with speculation, it's with opinion. And so the government lags because they have to really figure out what exactly happened. They have to do their due diligence. They have to check with the intel community, and then they have to determine their message. I think there are a few really good, reliable sources that tend to get it right a lot more than they get it wrong. Those two would be the Associated Press. They tend to put out really good, fair, accurate information. Again, sometimes in a war zone, reporters will get it wrong because things are happening so quickly. Wall Street Journal is also a favorite one of mine. I think they do an excellent job and do a fair job of reporting. A plethora of think tanks like Institute of Study for War, Policy Circle, have these great conversations with a variety of opinions, but those are solid places to get information. Where I would not get information is from cable news and from a bunch of pundits. I have to tell you why. I worked in cable news. I worked for several news organizations. They are out there grabbing whatever the newest piece of information is. They may not have the time to vet it all. They put it out there. They start talking and giving their opinions on it before it's fully vetted, because it's good TV, because it's more recent and more relevant, and that's what gets people talking, and that's what gets more eyeballs watching. You have to be very aware of those things. And I'm not limiting this to Fox or MS. It's everybody. They all do it.
Well, and I think, it's interesting. I'm looking at a comment that somebody made, and they said, I don't trust the media and I don't trust the government. And how does Heather really know that there are not biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine, right? So there is this fundamental distrust right now of a lot of different types of authority. But I think to the point you guys have made is you can't discount that people feel burned, right, by different sources of information. But I think at the heart of the policy circle, our encouragement is keep looking, keep asking questions, and stay curious enough to think, does that feel like a really provocative statement? Did they put 30 hashtags on that so they could hit everything in the world, right? Or is this something that feels thoughtful? Is it carefully curated? Is this a source over time, to your point, Dr. Kagan, that got it right more often than they didn't? Because there's not going to be perfection. And I would add to this list of resources, obviously the Policy Circle brief that we have produced on this, in addition to offering some background, understanding sort of the historical factors that led us to this moment in time where there is war. You can also look at other resources, including the Institute for the Study of War. We reference some other groups that we feel like are really putting out solid factual information, and you can be the judge. At the end of the day, as Americans, we have that prerogative to believe it or not, and to be the judge of it. I think our hope is that you've got some insight through this call that helps you feel like you have a little bit better understanding on the information war that takes place alongside the conventional war, and that we can be better stewards, I think, of the information that comes into our possession before we spread it back out into the world. And I think there's some incredible conversations that could still be had here, but it is drawing close to 13 minutes until we are out of time, which we're probably going to try to close this up sooner rather than later so that people can get back to their lunch breaks. But one of the things that is happening here that I think we might just want to touch on as we wrap this up is there is a bit, I think, of question, because this is a complex issue of, are we going to let Russia get away with it? Okay, there's a question in here. It seems like we did nothing in Crimea, right? Since 2014, they've been encroaching in on sovereign Ukraine. And I don't even want to open the bag on what this means for Taiwan and China. We'll have to save that for a call some other time. But maybe if you each want to just take a minute and say sort of what your thought is on the US policy to date. Feels like, it says to this person, that we're letting them get away with it. Do you think we're going to move into a stronger position to hold them accountable, or do you think we're going to continue along the same course? And I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Kagan. We're going to hold them accountable?
I sure hope so. Look, the United States is the leader of the free world. The free world is shocked by what it is that Putin is doing in invading a neighbor as a pure war of aggression, and doing so in a way that deliberately targets civilians, women, children, and the innocent, and doing it at scale that is horrific. And we've seen it. It's not okay. Right. And it is not all right for the United States and for its allies to turn a blind eye. Now, right now, the United States is providing some aid to the Ukrainian government and, of course, aid to the Ukrainian people. And Americans are providing a wide variety of aid through civil society organizations and other networks. That's wonderful. But I fear that the United States, the White House, may just want this war to end without actually thinking about the consequences of allowing an aggressive war on the continent of Europe to end in a way that is favorable to Putin and that doesn't defend the innocent people of Ukraine. And I do not think that our government is putting out a very strong narrative right now that backs the Ukrainian government and its incredibly successful defense of Ukraine. And I do not think that the United States is actually really leading as it should in the free world to say this is not only unacceptable, but in fact, if Putin continues in this way, we will not just speak, we will act to protect innocent civilians in Ukraine and defend the free world.
Heather?
The United States didn't do the right thing in 2008 when Russia took over South Ossetia, which is part of Georgia, a former Soviet republic. We basically did nothing then. We did nothing when Russia took over Crimea, essentially. And now we are taking actions, not fast enough. We have to do so much more, not just in the form of providing money to the situation through humanitarian aid, though that is important. We need to do more to provide lethal weapons to the Ukrainians. This is a moral right and responsibility. We don't want a war. I don't think any country, at least in the Western world, ever does. But sometimes a war finds you. And we have this God-given, beautiful country, which is the most successful in the world, an incredible system of a democracy. It is our responsibility to stand up and help others who need it. And I recall going to NATO meetings in Brussels and sitting down with our US counterparts. And when you would ask those from Estonia, from Latvia, from any of those Eastern European countries, Poland, what concerned them the most, they would say to me, Russia. They were concerned about this long before the United States does. If we don't stop, collectively stop Putin now, he will go after another country. So we have to do more. However, we should not forecast our actions. You often hear the president will say, we will not put boots on the ground. We will not do this or that. That's the wrong approach. You always want to keep your enemy guessing. Even though we may have no intention to do so, you don't want to signal that to a guy like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah. And then Kateryna, last word is with you. In terms of the Ukrainian people, what is their perception of the United States response and perhaps our resolve to actually to fulfill that moral obligation?
I want to say one thing is that Ukrainians are extremely proud of the military aid that they have been receiving. There's a lot of meme culture rising about javelins being the saviors of Ukraine. And I think that's something that needs to continue. I think the US needs to continue support Ukraine, at least with military aid, with military equipment. I think the perception of Ukrainians right now is that yes, we have enough help right now, but we need more later on. And I think President Zelensky said it best, the supplies that you send us for a week last us a day. And that's significant. And I believe that the more we show support to Ukraine, the more they will want to fight for the safety of the European continent and the West.
Wow. What you send for a week lasts for a day. And I think, Heather, to your point, there is frustration at the speed, right? And whether or not we're leading or reacting. So this is an incredible conversation. I could talk to the three of you all day. I really appreciate all the questions that everyone submitted. There's a few we didn't get to that I might actually forward to you guys individually. If y'all will shoot someone an email, I'm sure they would love to hear from you and get your perspective. But we're grateful for all the folks that spent sort of their lunch break or spent an hour with us this afternoon. Again, I encourage you to read the brief, host a conversation with your family, your neighbors, your coworkers. There's a list of resources in the brief, alluding to something Dr. Kagan said in terms of if you want to provide financial assistance to the humanitarian groups that are providing vital aid, we have a list of carefully vetted groups that we trust that are doing excellent work there. And if you know of resources that the Policy Circle should be sharing and promoting through our various networks, reach out to us directly and let us know. Again, thank you guys for this time. And for your valuable insights. And, you know, Kateryna, our thoughts and prayers are with your family that are still in the Ukraine. And we applaud you for the incredible work that you're doing here. So thank you all.